on a large scale, committees aren't scalable, right? If we're having, and also some crashes need a sort of a quick resolution as far as like an initial take, an initial determination, and that those committees could be really great structures as you have to elevate, and for an opportunity for the driver to be able to say their piece and argue their case. So I think that's really good. Trucking is difficult. It's an essential industry that every corner of the nation depends on, even without knowing it. To the average consumer, the supply chain is magic, and sometimes a black hole. Products on store shelves, dinner on restaurant tables, packages on doorsteps. It's expected to be there on time, every time, and only recognized if there's a service failure. But how is a sausage made? Who's talking about the issues that matter to trucking companies?
Welcome to True North Truck Thought, or the TTT Pod for short, a monthly podcast hosted by Litigious Transportation Consulting and brought to you by True North Companies. We're here to demystify the magic, address the black holes, and to talk trucking to the industry we love. Whether it's the latest research, upcoming laws and rules, safety issues and solutions, or practical discussions about real-life supply chain challenges, the TTT Pod is here to help the most important industry in our country to navigate its greatest challenges and opportunities. We bring together some of the best and brightest experts to talk about and tackle some of the most pressing industry issues. So without further ado, I'm Steve Kepler.
And I'm Sean Garney. Let's get trucking. One metric by which all motor carriers are judged is the number and rate of crashes. Certainly, the number of crashes experienced by a motor carrier can provide useful information, but in my opinion, only with the necessary context. Making crash preventability determinations provides us some of that important context. Now, FMCSA and its predecessor agency, the Federal Highway Administration, has long recognized the value and necessity of preventability determinations, having built them into their safety rating process beginning in 1993. More recently, FMCSA began accepting a subset of crashes from carriers seeking to improve their CSA scores by having preventable crashes removed from the calculation of their crash indicator scores. Carriers have long made crash preventability determinations internally, too, for reasons we'll be discussing at length today. But what is crash preventability? How is it used and why? I am very much looking forward to our conversation today. With us is a familiar guest and one of our absolute favorites, Bert, Tell It How It Is Mayo, renowned safety warrior and trucking gossip. Welcome back, Bert. Appreciate you being here. Also joining us today for the very first time is David O'Neill, who joined the Litigious Consulting team just over a year ago after a long career in safety at several of our nation's most recognizable fleets. David has been living and breathing safety for the bulk of his professional career and is with us today to talk a little shop. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Sean.
You bet. Well, before we start, and I know we want to jump right into this, but we do have an interesting preventability case on our hands today, and I just for a second want to take a moment to recognize the tragedy that happened in Baltimore with the fall of that ship and the tragic loss of lives, and how that stresses the importance of our infrastructure on our economy and our lives. And so I think all of our hearts go out to those who lost folks and to those who are going to have to continue to struggle with the challenges that bridge falling will bring to the industry and the supply chain going forward. So just wanted to acknowledge that. We've been thinking a lot about that. And was it preventable? Maybe we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, Sean, as a resident of the Baltimore area, that particular area of infrastructure is a huge impact on the region and the major port of Baltimore and major economic impacts for quite some time.
Well, Sean, I think that's a great place to start, just in the definition of preventability. And David, coming out of the industry, let me ask you, what can you define that preventable collision? What is a preventable collision?
So paraphrasing the definition I would use from a motor carrier standpoint, Bert, it's generally any event that could have been reasonably prevented on the part of the driver. So, with regard to the Baltimore event, obviously, we have a very limited set of facts and knowledge right now about the event itself, but on the surface, it appears to have been a mechanical issue with the ship. So if that's all I had to go on, then my inclination is that that's not a preventable collision. If the ship had full power, still ran into the bridge, then that's a different story. But again,
one scenario I like to pose it as we talk about preventability with motor carriers. One scenario I discuss usually is the red light or the stale green light scenario, and I see that all the time. And of course, on the insurance side, we have our own battles going on or investigations for certain reasons. But I commonly come across that light's been green since you've seen it a mile away, and then we run through a light and it's red as we cross under it, and there's an accident. And so, what do we do with the stale green? Just on that one, Dave, what should a driver do there?
So the driver should anticipate if the driver is able to see that light has been green for some period of time, then with reasonable knowledge that it's going to change at some point in the near future. So, I think the professional driver is going to start controlling the speed and start decelerating to some extent in anticipation of that. You're not going to necessarily look to come to a complete stop if the light's still green, but you should be anticipating, watching the cross traffic, and trying to make sure if the light does start to turn that you're able to come to a stop.
So let's. I love the start here. Let's set the stage for what is preventability. I'm going to provide a few definitions of preventability, and we can kind of pull out what we think are the most important parts of it, right? So FMCSA defines preventability in Part 385, and we're going to talk more about the government's role here in a second, but they define it as if a driver who exercises normal judgment and foresight could have foreseen the possibility of an accident that in fact occurred and avoided it by taking steps within his or her control, which could not have risked causing another kind of mishap. The accident was preventable. Okay, so that's FMCSA. That's in the regs. The National Safety Council, they define preventability, a preventable crash, as one in which the driver failed to do everything that he or she reasonably could have done to avoid it. So now we've got this word reasonable, which is just a disaster, right? That's a hard word. And then ATA, they have defined it as well. And they define it sort of as a question. Was the vehicle driven in such a way to make due allowances for the conditions of road, weather, and traffic, and to also assure that the mistakes of others did not involve the driver in a collision? That last definition, in my opinion, is tortured because it's sort of, I think maybe 15 to 50 lawyers worked on this language to take out and sanitize sort of everything that could have been scary from that. And so we get this thing that only looks at road condition, weather, and traffic and the actions of others, and fails to consider the actions of the driver. What do you guys think is a reasonable place between these three to sort of land? What are our keywords? What are the things that we're asking?
Yeah, so hearing FMCSA's definition read back, which obviously I've read before, but I was thinking, did I, in my very paraphrased manner, to start with Bert's question, did I capture the meat and potatoes of that? And I feel like, yeah, that's pretty well articulated in there. Now, I used the term reasonable, and then Sean, you said that that's tortured and perhaps a problem statement. That's been the term du jour that I've lived with over the better part of 20-something years. So it's kind of ingrained in the brain, so to speak.
Well, and I said tortured only because lots of people think reasonable is different, right? And if you have a conversation with your driver, the driver's going to be like, "Hey, this was reasonable. I did all the reasonable things." So it's just difficult in that way. Sorry, Bert, go ahead.
But I would agree with David. I've always used reasonable and not considered that torturous. I guess I'll use your term. But what I would ask in the same question, I would ask, what are we doing with the information? What are we doing with this determination? And if we're making preventability calls inside the motor carrier for training, awareness, those things to prevent future accidents, I'm okay with reasonable. If I'm getting into court, I'm probably going to avoid that altogether.
Well, and I think the other thing
that on you there, but there's a third piece to that. There's the training piece, the re-education, but then there's also, potential consequences from are we going to allow you to remain a qualified driver in our fleet? There's that aspect of it as well.
And I think the issue reasonable, to your point, Bert, it's different by different people. That's why a lot of fleets have crash investigation, internal committees, because everyone comes at it from a different perspective. And I think and as we know, every crash is different, right? It's hard to have a standard approach of how you're evaluating every crash. So that reasonableness, if you take into account all that, that's why you have these multiple people making those analyses, so that ultimately you can come up with what reasonable means from that perspective in that particular crash. So I think the one thing that in the FMCSA definition that's not mentioned specifically, but what they deal with their crash preventability determination program is, it's kind of unwritten, is should the driver have even been there in the first place, right? Did he have an hours of service violation or some other reason that shouldn't have been there in the first place, regardless of what happened in the specific crash event? And that's a big factor in how they assess preventability for the program.
Yeah, and I do think that's important. I think we'll set that aside for just a second, because I'd be curious to hear from David a little bit about how much of those sort of extra factors are considered when thinking about preventability. I am going to say a phrase, and I want you guys to tell me if you think it is synonymous with preventability. Defensive driving. If a driver is acting in a defensive way and driving, is that the same as the driver could not have prevented? Is that a lot? I've had a lot of these conversations over the years with carriers, and then even as a part of the National Truck Driving Championships and those committees around preventability. And often, David and I just looked at one yesterday. Was the driver acting in a defensive manner? And in the circumstance that we were talking through, a car driver had come up unnoticed on the right side of a car on a highway. Well,
the right side of the truck.
What's that?
The right side of the truck.
Yes, that's what I meant to say. Thank you. And the driver, we sort of concluded that the driver wasn't driving defensively or appropriately because they hadn't noticed that truck approaching that car approaching on the right. So I digress. Defensive driving versus preventability.
I don't see them as synonymous, but they're certainly connected. And that's a tortured way of splitting a hair, maybe.
Well, I think it goes to the hearer's definition again. Defensive that's a 24/7, 365 every minute of every day, and that's what I struggle with on that.
Is that a reasonable standard? Like that's the whole question here, right? Like, is being defensive 110%, is that a reasonable standard?
And I think that's, in general terms, I would agree, but I think there are, and that's why every crash scenario is different, because there may be circumstances where the driver has to make an aggressive maneuver to avoid a bad situation, right? Particularly if it's precipitated by another vehicle, and he did this action to avoid something worse happen that some would deem to be not defensive, but the scenario called for it, and he or she made that maneuver to avoid a worse situation.
Well, but I hate to add this to it, because we started this with two kind of buckets of preventability, and I'll maybe even defensive in there now, Sean. But I think there's a third. We talk about what the motor carrier does with that information. As David said, train, retain, awareness, programs, even equipment, safety technology and equipment. We got what the government's doing with that. But I live in a world where I see what happens when it gets to court. And, as a motor carrier, training defensive driving is a must. At least the driver may not have acted, but negligence can be removed or partially removed. If you say, we did the training, here's the documented training, the driver, maybe he failed to act the way he should have because of some circumstances. The reasonable piece comes into play.
So, Bert, that's an interesting segue, because I think a lot of people, maybe since you opened that door, a lot of people conflate preventability with fault, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because they're not always the same, right?
No, exactly. I mean, fault I see is what simply put, for me, it's what the officer at the scene determination, right? It's not at fault. We're not cited. We're all good. But preventability is usually when we wind up in court, what the driver did or what the motor carrier did, as we know. I think, Sean, you parked should he have been there or should she have been there? That's becoming such an issue now, and we all know of the famous or infamous case out in Texas in the ice or the, cold weather icy conditions. And that was that determination that driver should have never been there. And that, unfortunately, I think it's just the environment we operate in, and all we can do is the best we can, because I don't know we'll ever be able to get away from those scenarios.
So, I mean, I think this is an interesting conversation in that, Bert, you just highlighted like one of the what the industry feels is a big peril of having one of these systems is the discoverability of that. And there's a lot of really great articles about that discoverability and how to potentially protect that, which I think we can talk about here in the future. But given the risk and the rise in these untenable nuclear verdicts, why are carriers still making these preventability determinations? So maybe we'll deal with the why, and then we can jump into the how, if that sounds right to you guys. So I have a few reasons for the why, but I'd certainly like to hear from you guys first, because I stole mine from a legal article written by somebody in the firm. So
I would like to ask David, being closest to the industry recently, and why did y'all do it, David?
I think for me, the why is so I know what I'm dealing with. So I know I can either, benchmark's not necessarily the right term, but at least internally gauge the success or lack thereof of my fleet in terms of safety performance. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? What do we need to do differently? Compare and contrast between different, and I've worked for some large carriers, so compare and contrast different geographic regions, or even within terminals. So I know there are ways you can still do that without putting a P or an NP next to a crash. But I think, a little bit old school, and some of the carriers that I was with are certainly more legacy carrier, have that approach. So because we've always done it that way is one answer. And certainly over the more recent years, we did have those conversations with the legal department or within, peers in the industry about, or at conferences and different things, should we still be doing this? So that conversation is out there. If I was starting a new motor carrier today, I might take a more serious look at that. And do I need to assign those? You've got risk either way. The crash happened. Whether or not I say it's preventable or not is, not necessarily going to protect me fully from an adverse judgment or from a nuclear verdict, but I understand the legal, perhaps the insurance world standpoint on, or viewpoint on, not adding to the risk, if that makes sense.
I totally. just my seat, I totally agree with that position. I want to see it used to determine where we go with training, where we go with selection, all of the things we've talked about. There's a need for the data, right? The root cause. We got to know what happened so we can hopefully prevent it going forward within the fleet. But I don't know it needs to be publicly recorded, I guess is the statement, to become a smoking gun. Maybe the blue ink and black ink, like you said, David, there's a way to write it without recording it.
The thing is that the other side of the house, if you will, is going to do it if you don't. So you, right? So they're going to try and throw it back on you. So if nothing else, from a risk mitigation standpoint and liability, you should do it. But I think, to me, the why coming at it from a safety perspective is you want to make you want to correct, and if your driver was at fault or had errors, you want to correct that, and you want to spread that message to other drivers in your fleet so you can improve your safety programs and not have those situations occur again.
Well, let me ask y'all three. Y'all are in different motor carriers every day, as I am. But do y'all see this is something I see as a need for? So motor carriers, I don't want to give advice, but it's what this is about. But I see very few doing true root cause analysis after anything, crash, injury, any event. And I think that's so critical to what we're talking about today, but just to what you just mentioned, Steve.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Some of them are doing it more than others. And frankly, I think you could say the same thing about the government, right? The government doesn't do that type of analysis, even with all the resources they have. There's still a lot of questions about crashes and what contributes to them and how we can mitigate them. And is the regulatory framework appropriate to mitigate crashes? So there's a lot. So,
okay, let's, I just want to kind of keep on track here, keep on this motor carrier kick. I'm going to give you my answers that I lifted from a paper by Mike Langford, who is a partner at the Scopolitas law firm. He was writing in the Trucking Industry Defense Association. Sounds like a lawyer thing, never been, probably won't be invited. But he gave 3 reasons for preventability, for making preventability determinations. The first is assessing if remedial training, discipline, or termination is warranted. And that's one thing we didn't mention here. We talked about trends, but we didn't talk about what are we going to do with the driver now. So that's one. The second is providing metrics to discover the trends that need to be addressed. These, Mike talks about sort of global trends, like technologies that might avert accidents or trainings on specific scenarios or intersections, that sort of thing. And then finally, and I thought this one was interesting, defense in a post-termination employment claim, right? So we need to have reasons for our actions, I suppose, and that's another important, from Mike's perspective, an important factor here. So I think there's a lot of really good reasons, and we can say it's for safety, and we can definitely believe that. And the reason is because if we don't know why the crash happened or if we could have prevented it, then we can't act toward that in the future. So let's talk a little bit about the how now, just for a second. And I've worked with a few carriers trying to set these types of programs up. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I was with the American Trucking Associations when they published this gem, the Trucking Industry Guidelines for Recording Fleet Vehicle Accidents and Determining Preventability, which is a very catchy name. It doesn't even come with an acronym.
Did you come up with that name? You had to have titled that, Sean. I
added a couple extra words. Yeah, I thought recording vehicle fleet accidents was super important, so I added that. Thanks for asking, Bert. Yeah, they were going to put my picture on it, but didn't fit. I totally forgot my train of thought. Oh, so this book tells us a little bit about how to develop the definitions around fleet vehicle accidents, as well as typical scenarios in which, that may be preventable or not preventable. They've since redone this book, and you can still get it at ATA's website. The National Safety Council also has a similar document that's very useful. But let's just talk about, in general, we'll start with, I'm a small motor carrier, 50 trucks, and I want to start making preventability determinations for the reasons we talked about before. What are our first steps what does it look like? Is it just a safety director? It's a small fleet. Is it just a safety director kind of looking at police accident reports? Does it, involve the driver or other people? What do you guys think about the best way to set something like this up?
I think in a small fleet, it's more likely to be just the safety director or similar that's making that determination.
And I would hope if in that case that he has that resource there, Sean. I've seen it. I like it. It at least gives him or her some guidance. Yes, absolutely. And the smaller fleets, that's what I see.
So what information are they relying on then to make the determinations? If it's just one person with a very distinct set of circumstances, what are they relying on?
Typically, I think it falls back a lot to the police accident report, the looking at damage to your own equipment, the adverse party's equipment, the other party, I shouldn't say adverse, but the other party's equipment, interviewing, having a conversation with the driver, reviewing in-cab video or dash cam type video if anything exists. Hours of service logs can be a data point for that. So as much information as possible, but probably the police accident report is at the core of that.
Yeah, and I would say today, out-facing cameras have changed a lot of that. These things are put to bed pretty quick if they have the camera information.
Well, and I think going further, I think all that's great thoughts and input, but the history of that driver, what's the hiring practices of the carrier, what training they've received, because all those are potential risks. If there's a legal action, those types of things are going to be brought up as part of that process. So those are other things that should weigh in at some level.
Well, I think about my comment earlier about root cause and how we stop. We'll use a small carrier, and I think even large carriers stop going that deep because of things they don't want to know, or maybe they know and have turned a blind eye to, and no one hit me for that. But we know drivers are pushed. We know drivers run hot loads. We know drivers have family issues. We know drivers don't get proper rest sometimes when they're off, and I rarely see us go that deep to make that determination. And those are critical. And we know they are. We talk about it in every conference we go to.
And that's why I brought them up, because I agree with you, Bert. I don't think people go to that depth, and that's a question, right? Because if you go to that depth, you're potentially exposing yourself, right? But wouldn't you want to know that rather than not know and be prepared how to deal with it? I mean, that's a question. But
so some carriers set up committees, let's start this with, we have a 50 driver carrier, and the safety director is unilaterally making preventability determinations. Presuming this is to improve driver skills and sort of acknowledge deficiencies, what steps can that safety director take to garner the trust of that driver so that it doesn't feel punitive, or that it feels helpful? Or is that something that we need to legitimately think about? Should we just be making the determinations? What do you guys think?
I think a good safety director is going to take that into account and try to make it more a conversation than the punitive approach. That does not always happen.
Yeah, and so I think that's where I was getting at. Like, we were talking about the process, and okay, a safety director can just make it, and often the police accident report illuminates most of the circumstances. But I've heard frequently that, before the determination is made and the investigation is maybe even started, to begin having a conversation early on with that driver about the circumstances and what could have been done, what should have been done, that sort of thing. We
Absolutely.
Also got a question, David, yesterday from a carrier who said, do you think we should share the camera footage with the driver?
My answer is almost always 100% yes. Show them what were you, tell me if I'm in that safety director's seat, I'm going to show you this. I want you to walk me through what you were seeing at the time. And the example we had yesterday, where you could clearly see an approaching car in the right rear view mirror, a motorist passenger vehicle, for several seconds, yet the driver did not see that. So I would want the driver to walk me through, what were you looking at? Excuse me as I knock my glasses off. But what were you looking at in that moment, or in those that span of several seconds, that you missed this approaching object? It was not in your blind spot, right? You had your mirrors set great. You should have been able to see this and just try to walk through those circumstances and scenarios.
Yeah, I think to that question, Sean, it's a good one. Following up on David's point, being as fully transparent as you can with the driver, because you don't want to create this friction between it's us versus them, right? And because the end goal is everyone's trying to get to the end goal to be safe on the highway. So having that conversation early and with that driver and working through the process together to the extent, as much as practicable, I think helps create that culture you want to make sure you have in the company, and to have the driver know that the carrier's got their back, right? And so, because that also will permeate to other drivers in the company too. If the carrier handles that situation properly, that the drivers will feel, okay, you know what, I'm working for someone that cares about my well-being. That's right. And making me a better driver.
It's a culture. Sean, I go back to cameras. We all got enough gray hair to remember before cameras, right? BC, I guess we call that. But motor carriers, y'all heard it. I heard it 1,000 times. I don't want to document what I did wrong. The plaintiff is going to figure it out, or they're going to make an assumption and make you look really bad in court. But the truth is going to come out. So that whole thing of I don't call it hiding, but I think Steve used the perfect word of being transparent, especially with your driver, and retraining if he needs be, or whatever we need to do with that. But there's other circumstances within the motor carrier that need to be trained, educated around the event. And operations to me is key. Talking to that dispatcher, what did you do or not do? Those things need to happen. So I think transparent, Steve, is to me the word of the day, because that's what this is all about: making the highway safer for all of us.
Yeah,
I like transparency as the word of the day more than tortured. So
yeah. I beat Sean on today. That is rare. Hang on, let me.
All right, just continue to torture me with my word choice, people. Okay, this kind of thing is not preventable. All right. I'm just kidding.
Well, it's supposed to be part education, part entertainment, right? So
That's right. Okay, so Bert just talked about operations and talk to the dispatcher and trying to figure out what some of these root causes were. Some carriers, and then Steve talked about transparency and being on the driver's side, and some carriers do that by developing committees. They want to make all these decisions via committee. So what's the benefits of a committee for one? But what I'm even more interested in is who the heck is on my committee? All right, now I'm a bigger motor carrier, got a little bit more resource. Who am I going to put on? Am I going to put on myself and 3 other people who think just like me? Or am I going to reach across the organization? Am I going to talk to people who don't know anything about driving a commercial motor vehicle? What do you guys think about that?
Cross section. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
No, David, go ahead.
So I'll just use an example from one carrier that I was with that's on the larger size. An accident itself or a crash itself wasn't necessarily judged by committee. It might be judged by or determined by like a regional safety manager, and then there's an evaluation by a senior manager at a corporate location or something like that. So some element of review. The one committee approach that I saw work quite well was when a driver has had a certain number of accidents that might put them up to be disqualified, right? To no longer be able to operate in this particular fleet. At that point, that's where the committee approach came in, and that committee was made up of some senior drivers with significant tenure with the company who had strong safety records. Perhaps road team captains are typically the kind of best of the best in that driver universe, as well as a couple of members of management, maybe an HR manager, maybe an operations manager, or like a district director or something along those lines. Again, it's all scalable depending on the size of the carrier, but just to have some different voices in the room to evaluate what you're looking at. I think whether it's a particular crash or whether or not we should retain a driver, what we need to look at is the totality of circumstances, right? It's not a singular moment in time, but it's what led up to it, what the patterns are, and things like that. So, and as well, what we talked earlier about having a conversation with the driver on the front side, and whether you want to call it interviewing the driver or whatever term, but trying to understand the driver's perspective, and are they committed to improving? How seriously are they taking retraining opportunities, remedial education, or whatever the case may be? So
I think, David, that's the third word of the day, and it starts with a T, right? Totality of circumstances. I look at that. I absolutely agree there, because every perspective in different parts of the organization can bring to bear their experience in evaluating that crash, and what aspects of it could have influenced on changing it for the positive. So I firmly, having an operations perspective, having a driver perspective, having a safety perspective, having a training perspective. If you want to have legal folks in there too, because liability and risk is something you need to think about, and that perspective is important as well.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Bert.
Well, I think about it. I give a shout out to my good friend Scott Randall over at Hogan. He used to coin this all the time, and I assume he still does. But it's one of the greatest phrases. He said, we in the industry, we commonly put the driver, the person who's least likely to make the right decision, in the position to make the decision. And his point is that we need to build processes around him and procedures around him or her that operations and other departments help the driver make the right decisions, because that to me is root cause, right? All of those circumstances around that event are what caused it, and it's not always what decision the driver made.
Yeah. So I appreciate that, Bert. What I heard from David about this committee, and I just kind of don't want to lose this point, because I have talked to carriers about that and talked about the value of a committee and that sort of thing. But, on a large scale, committees aren't scalable, right? If we're having, and also some crashes need a sort of a quick resolution as far as like an initial take, an initial determination, and that those committees could be really great structures as you have to elevate, and for an opportunity for the driver to be able to say their piece and argue their case. So I think that's really good. I want to leave. First of all, I almost moved to a different conversation without putting Bert on the hot seat. So I want an opportunity to do that. But first, I read that paper by Mike Lanford, and he had an interesting idea on this preventability case. And he was talking about discoverability and how do we protect that. And interestingly, David was like, hey, why do we do this? Well, because we've always done this, and we've always called it a preventability committee. And his suggestion was to call it a post-accident remediation report, right? To be clear that what we're doing is investigating the circumstances of this crash to provide future, remedial training or benefit to the carrier. I don't know how that works, and I suggest to everybody who is listening to call, not your lawyer, call Scopelitis, and they're going to help. No, call any lawyer you want, and they'll talk about why that's important or what that makes sense. So, but first, Bert, let's talk about insurance, because
My
The
favorite
thing
topic.
the thing is, most people who rate your insurance will tell you, and FMCSA will tell you this too, the presence of a single crash in the past increases your likelihood for a crash in the future. However, we also know that depending on whose data you looked at, somewhere between a third and 2/3 of all crashes are not preventable on the part of us. So how does insurance view well, two things. How does insurance view crashes? Do they like to consider preventability as part of that? Um, and two, do they encourage these types of preventability determinations? Do you get do you talk about that with carriers a lot? How does it work in insurance? If I have a preventability program, does it make a lick of difference to your people?
So the big loaded question. I'm going to be brief, Sean. You will learn that word here because I'm going to answer this very quickly. But the brief answer is, forgive me, all my insurance peeps, they don't care. And what I mean by that is results is all that matters. Now, if we have some issues and we can mitigate that and we show programs that work and we show that motor carriers are doing all they can do, yes, absolutely, they can come back and engage. And there's some great insurance companies with great LP people out there, and I can run them all. We'll look at that and go, this was an anomaly. This was a shock loss. Y'all probably heard that term. But at the end of the day, the big thing that matters more than anything is your past results. So, and we have all could sit here and name some horrific incidences where motor carriers weren't at fault. It was completely non-preventable, and we spent 20, 30, 40 million dollars on the thing. So,
So you don't care if it was preventable or not because it's probably going to cost you a little money no matter what.
Well, I mean, yeah, if you look at it from a pure business transaction, that motor carrier invests premium, the insurance company pays out losses, and that needs to, we need to pay more premium than we pay out losses.
Yeah.
And that keeps everybody in business, and we keep our rates lower. The problem with, you mentioned it, you referenced a little bit, whole other topic, I'm sure, is the nuclear verdict thing and how that's changing the landscape. But yeah, I mean, it's the short answer is they don't care. That's probably a harsh statement because I know they go in and look, and I write up write-ups for motor carriers all the time, and that's where I do the digging. I look at trends, I look at preventability, and I highlight all of that for the underwriter because I want the underwriter to understand it's just not a number you see. They're trending down, or they had more preventable or non-preventable losses, and they had preventable losses to highlight their program. It does matter in the end, but the biggest factor in insuring anybody is loss history.
It's not harmful, but it's not super helpful.
I wouldn't say it's not super helpful. It's just,
I would think, Bert, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I think just having a program to have a program doesn't make a lick of difference.
Well, that's motor carrier insurance companies are very sophisticated, and they have people like all of us that go in and look, and you hand them this big 3-ring binder, and you have to blow the dust off of it. You don't get any credit for that. They see what's happening.
Yeah, proof is in the pudding, and show how you need to show how your preventability program is impacting on your safety posture.
That's right.
And having connecting, to use a term David uses often, connective tissue between the two. And
exactly.
And feeding that back to every aspect of the company and the carrier, of showing why it's being done and its impacts. I think is helpful.
Yeah, I've got great motor carrier. I mean, not just look good on paper. They do an incredible job, but they are right now paying some rates they shouldn't be based off of what we would see and look at. I mean, they're doing everything right, but they've got bad loss history, and that just follows you for 3, 5, 7 years. So anyway, yes, it is.
In 1997, FMCSA estimated the proportion of crashes that were preventable. And they put it in a rulemaking document, which I've been prone to dig through for no good reason. What do you guys think that number was?
Rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was in the rabbit hole for a while the other day. What do you guys think? What percentage, what proportion? It's a fraction. I'll give you that clue. What fraction of crashes
On a
are
pure
preventable.
preventability statement, man, I personally, just knowing the crashes I know, I'm guessing 75%.
Steve, there's a
I,
prize to the winner.
yeah, I think the higher end. It depends. Well, it's back to how you define how you define it.
They define preventability as a driver who exercised normal judgment for. We got this right from before.
Reasonable.
Yeah, reasonable. Torture.
Well, yeah,
Tortured reasonable.
I know, right? Well, part of the challenge is not to change the subject, but we know in large truck crashes, when there's a multi-vehicle crash, 70% of the time, it's the small operator, four-wheeler, that's causing the problem. So, but I, to stick to the and what I will say, when I was back doing investigations years ago with the agency, it was a very rare event when the determination was made to be not preventable. So rare.
I may raise my number.
Yeah.
So you're at 75%. Steve's at rare. What do we got for David? Medium well?
Yeah, no, it's well done. It's definitely on the high side, and whether it's 2/3 or 3/4 or up to 90%. In my experience, the significant majority of crashes are determined to be preventable.
Well, and I know, Sean, you were part of. Sorry, Bert. I mean, I know you were part of a conversation that we had with a very large carrier, and they indicated to us that their number was 30%.
Preventable?
Not preventable.
Oh, not preventable. Yeah.
So,
well, before you throw that out, Sean, I want to tell all our motor carrier friends out there listening, this is not an indictment. This is pure preventability as the government would measure it, because there's a conversation that's had. It's this right here. Why do we get blamed? Why are we at fault? And that's not what we're talking about.
You're right, and that's why I prefaced. Sorry, Sean, I know you wanted to talk.
All good.
I prefaced my statement, when I used to do them, because I think now that I've been on the industry side, I know a heck of a lot more, and they need to change how they're doing things, because it's not right. Not right.
So the answer, and Bert, you make a good point, because this captures all crashes, and we know that in two vehicle crashes, car truck crashes, that this is a little flipped on its head. So this is single vehicle crashes and all of that. They said in 1997 that the number was 2/3. 2/3 of crashes were preventable. They gave 3 years for rates. In 1994, the recordable rate was 0.804 per million, and the preventable was 0.553 per million, and the others were around there, and they ended up using that for their accident factor reporting. So
I was driving in the 90s. I could have contributed to that number. Just so y'all know, I'll let y'all guess what side of that.
But it's an interesting point, Sean, because that data is 30 years old, and things have changed quite a bit in the past 30 years. I did a back of the envelope analysis, because the safety rating factor, it uses similar numbers, but I did a recordable rate today versus a recordable rate. Now we're talking recordable versus preventable. But back then in the safety rating, the recordable rate was it was 0.747 and 0.839 for urban, and now that number has dropped significantly based upon 2021 data. It's now down to 0.6.
Really?
So yes. So if nothing else, I mean, they need to revise those numbers and how carriers are being evaluated during the safety rating process.
All right, fellas. Well, really appreciate this conversation about how motor carriers use crash preventability. Of course, we maybe didn't come up with the idea, right? Maybe we got the idea from some other folks that were making crash preventability determinations pretty early on, particularly the federal government. And we could talk about the history of sort of where that came from. But I think what we want to talk about is where this might be going in the future, where it is today, as far as the government helping us make crash preventability determinations using the CSA program and the crash preventability determination program. And what do we see as some of the successes and failures, the current state and the future state. So I don't know, Steve, to put you on the spot, if you want to give us just a brief sort of overview of kind of where we are today with this crash preventability program and what carriers should know about it.
Yeah, so a couple of things. It's been around for a couple of years now, since 2020, but there's 12 crash types that carriers can submit for determinations by the agency. Essentially, they use the data queue system to submit their requests. There's lots of things they need to submit in association with that. Requirements of police accident report. FMCSA does this analysis versus inspections, which the states handle. But they make a determination of whether it's not preventable, or undecided, and then they'll post the final determinations to the CSA SMS. If it's not preventable, it is removed from the carrier's basic CSA basic score calculation. And there's 12 crash types now that are, and the reason they went through a whole process, they did a determination program, but one of the main reasons they came up with those initial crash types was they were supposed to be the simpler ones to adjudicate, if you will, versus more complicated. And so they've done that. It's been pretty successful for those that have chosen to use it as a carrier. There's been about 55,000 requests submitted to the system. About 28% were denied as ineligible because some people are starting to flood the system, and so that's an important consideration. But of the eligible crashes that were submitted, 96% of them were deemed to be not preventable. So if you get one that's eligible, most likely they're going to agree with you. So now FMCSA put out last year a notice on additional changes they would like to make for the program, and there's some additional things that they're contemplating as part of that change. Based upon what they've learned, one of the big things that they're proposing to change is to include the allowance of video to be used in the process. So, which could and they based on their proposed changes, they believe that the amount of requests will double. So, and many of the changes they're proposing are favorable. I think favorably looked on by carriers. For one of the biggest issues is struck in the rear crashes. And currently, there's only a couple of scenarios that are eligible. They're going to expand that particular crash type. So hopefully they'll follow through with those changes. We think they'll happen this year. But I think the bottom line is, if you're a carrier, if you're not using this system, you should. You should take advantage of it because I think it takes a lot of resources by the agency. But I think by and large, it's proven to be a good exercise and useful results for most carriers who are taking advantage of it.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add to that a little bit, Steve, to say, when CSA came around, the industry was frustrated that it was using all crashes, regardless of preventability, to measure our safety. And so the industry made a lot of noise over the course of 10 years, probably. And ultimately, FMCSA said, okay, we'll stand a program up, but we can't look at all crashes. We can't be the arbiter of truth. But the industry has demonstrated to us quite clearly that there are some crashes that are almost always not preventable, 96% of the time, it turns out. And so they've opened up a limited set of scenarios that carriers can submit to. But those carriers that do submit and win see their scores increase. Any guesses what other carriers not using the program in their same peer group, what happens to their scores? Right, it gets worse.
Yeah, because it's a relative scoring system.
Exactly. So carriers out there that are not investigating their crash types and seeing if it matches what FMCSA is offering are seeing their scores go up, and they're not sure why. So, a very, very good program. Hoping.
So, Sean, I got a question on that, or maybe you, Steve, or David, as y'all help motor carriers. I know y'all, that's part of what you do is, so what's the quickest way to get one accepted and when, I'll call it, and what's the quickest way to get one denied?
First of all, make sure it meets the criteria for one of the eligible categories, right? Be clear and concise in your documentation. I guess be professional and respectful is usually another pretty good strategy. But I think the acronym is BLUF, bottom line up front. Say what you're there to say it, and get done. Because again, we've talked about, potential backlogs, and I'm hearing, have experienced and continue to hear 90 days plus to get one reviewed and adjudicated. So the more information you can provide in the most readable format, I think, increases your odds of success.
Is that all states, David, or do you see in some states struggle more than others?
Yeah, it's a good question.
It's happening on the federal level.
Yeah.
So it's for everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. So what's happened, Bert, it's a really good point. I think David's on point. Be succinct to the point, but be complete, and make sure you've got evidence and documentation out of the gate. Make sure you do the work up front, because to David's point, what's happening is they're delaying making determinations because now more people are using it, and now they're getting into these more complex scenarios where technically FMCSA has a contractor doing a lot of these initial determinations, and so they're overloaded. And what has happened and what's contributing to the delay is they're having to engage the agency on a lot of these decisions because was the documentation good enough? It's a more complex scenario. So to get it done and get it adjudicated quickly, do your homework up front and make sure that you're clear in your request, and don't put things that are questionable into the system. Don't take the spaghetti on the wall approach.
And the quickest way to get your data queue denied is to submit an ineligible crash type. And the biggest risk of using the program is submitting an eligible crash type that was in fact preventable. And most often, to Steve's earlier point, it's preventable because the driver should not have been there in the first place. Hours of service, CDL licensure, that sort of thing. To your point, Steve, we've had two phases already, right? We had the demonstration phase, and now we've got the programs phase, and they added a bunch of new crash types when they made the program permanent. And those crash types, to your point, Steve, got a little bit more complex, right? And a little bit more difficult. And so to date, I did a little bit of data crunching. To date, phase 1 crash types have been deemed eligible 82% of the time. So 82% of crashes that are submitted under those crash types are in fact considered preventable, and of those, or are eligible, and of those, they have a 96% success rate or something like that. The phase 2 crashes, only 48% are ultimately considered eligible. And so what we want to do, I think, my biggest tip to carriers is scrutinize the crash. Make sure it's eligible. FMCSA actually has a lot of great resources on their website about what specifically they're looking for in each one of those crash scenarios. Make sure we're picking the first one, because it does take a long time. If things got to go back and forth, you're going to be waiting there a long, long time.
And is there anything a motor carrier can do, Sean, that if they're certain it falls within the 12, but they get denied?
Not right now.
Okay. That's the most common question I get. And I've seen it, and it's struck in the rear, uncontrolled. I mean, in that, 5, 6, 7 o'clock position, it still gets denied. So I'm just seeing if there's any tips we can give them.
Sadly, no.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, it's been a great podcast. I think we can go probably for another hour or so talking about crash preventability. I really did want to scrutinize that ocean liner crash and determine if it should have been preventable. I feel confident that if we had gone through that process, we would learn that the first change that the port is likely to make is to require tugboats to pull those boats all the way through the channel rather than letting them drive on their own. But we'll see what happens in the long run. So with that, I want to give everybody their parting wisdom here before Steve sends us out. From my point, I would just encourage everybody to strongly consider preventability as a way to learn more about your fleet. And as a way to discover important trends and solve critical problems. So thanks everybody for being here, especially Bert, who I think I called safety worry and trucking gossip, which hopefully sticks. So I'll pass it to Bert and then David, and then Steve, you can take us home.
Just words of wisdom. It's spring, so we get a lot of rain. Construction starting. Be careful on the road. And in May, if we don't talk to you, you got road check coming. Get ready, get prepared, know what's happening. Thank you. Be safe on the road. David?
Yeah, I would just add to what Sean said from a preventability determination standpoint. Consistency is key. Make sure you're determining preventability with the same approach all the time, every time.
I would just echo something I said earlier in the program. Be transparent. It's important to create the right culture in your company about this, because ultimately we're all in the business of reducing crashes, and you have to approach it in the right manner. They're going to happen, unfortunately. It's part of our business, but you need to take what you can to turn it into a positive to help you better in the future. And I also think, on a tip with Bert's point about, now the weather's clearing, work zones, trucks are way overrepresented in work zone crashes, way overrepresented. So please make sure you're being careful, and your drivers, and know where things are happening, know the zones, know those work areas, and plan your work accordingly.
Fantastic. Well, thanks all. Appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the TTT Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comments section or send us an email to transportationnews@truenorthcompanies.com. Thanks and have a safe day.